So in this chapter, we're going to go over social thinking, social influence, antisocial relations, and pro-social relations, and we're going to break down each one of these. Social psychology is a scientific study of how people's thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors, how those things are influenced by actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. But the definition here is the scientific study of how we think about, influence, and relate to one another as well. And excuse me, this social psychologists use scientific methods to study how people think. They study the social influences that explain why the same person will act differently in different situations. Um, and also, when you think about it, the uh, there's so many like range of topics when it comes to our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. There's so many different things that can play a part in why that person or why that individual act differently in that social situation or in varying situations. Okay, so with the fundamental attribution error is the tendency for observers to overemphasize personal characteristics and ignore situational factors in judging others' behavior. Okay, now an example: if someone cuts us off while driving, right? Our first thought might be, what a jerk, or instead considering the possibility that the driver is rushing someone to the airport. On the flip side, when we cut someone off in traffic, we tend to convince ourselves that we had to do so. We focus on situational factors like being late to a meeting or ignoring what our behavior might say about our own character. So, the Napolitan and colleagues, actually, students attributed the behavior of others to personal traits, even when they were told that behavior was a part of an experimental situation. So and there was a study actually, and they in the study they said when something bad happened to someone else, subjects blame that person's behavior on personality 65% of the time, but when something bad happened to the subjects, they blame themselves only 44% of the time, blaming the situation they were in much more often. So basically, with fundamental attribution error, it explains why we often judge others harshly while letting ourselves off the hook at the same time by rationalizing our own unethical behavior. Isn't that interesting? I think it's interesting. And this questions actually are this particular circumstance or this image uh, thinks about, like, when you think about like homeless people and you might say, well, they probably drink too much, or they probably um, you know they probably made a decision, they're lazy. Oftentimes we attribute poverty and homelessness to social circumstances or to personal dispositions rather than situations that could have been out of their control, and it definitely will reflect our political views as well. So, when it comes to attitudes, it definitely does affect our actions. Their feelings influenced by beliefs, which predisposes people to have specific reactions to objects, people, and events. So, there's two different types of attitudes: the peripheral route persuasion and the central route persuasion. The central route to persuasion occurs when a person is persuaded by the content of the message. The peripheral route to persuasion occurs when a person is persuaded by something other than the message's content. So, an example of the central route persuasion is okay. So, though the person has a car, the person gets influenced by the features shown of the new model of the car. The advertisement has shown facts and figures that really show the car to be better than what the person has been using. This is the case of central route persuasion. Okay, so an example of peripheral route is basically It basically occurs when someone evaluates a message, such as an advertisement, on the basis of physical attractiveness, background music, or other surface level characteristics rather than the actual content of the message. So when I hear the term foot in the door phenomenon, it basically is a technique, or excuse me, the tendency for people who have first agreed to a small request to comply later with a larger request. So, okay, so an example would be when a friend asks to borrow a small amount of money, then later asks to borrow a larger amount of money, right? Um, so that would be like, because you tended to agree, then you might agree um, or comply later. So the reason that the foot in the door technique works, or phenomenon, is because people have a natural need for consistency. People prefer not to contradict themselves in both actions and beliefs. Um, and the foot in the door technique gains compliance by creating the opportunity for people to be consistent. Um, and I can see how that could be true. Typically, like I have a cleaning lady, and initially, she started like saying, "Hey, I know I'm not coming until Friday, but do you think you can pay me prior, that like earlier in that day, to make sure, so because I have to do A, B, C, and D." Then it was like, "Well, I know I'm not coming until Friday. Do you think you can pay me on Wednesday?" So at some point I'm thinking that she might ask me to do it for free, and I've been kind of questioning, um, like her business, and wondering whether I should keep her as my cleaning lady. But it's just, I did agree initially because it seemed pretty easy. Like, yeah, for sure, I'll comply. But now you're like asking for money well in advance, prior to you even coming to do the job that you told me that you would do. um, Role is a set of expectations about a social position, defining how those in the position ought to behave, right? So it's that set of expectations on how you are supposed to behave in a position. Now, when it comes to like attitudes that follow behavior, right? And that principle is, although we cannot directly control our feelings, we influence them by altering our behavior so we conform. So it's like adjusting our behavior or thinking towards some group standards. So, people on a sports team, maybe you're changing your behavior, to have a mutual liking towards something. Such attitudes in turn, it can promote positive behavior. So think about like when attitudes do not fit with actions, tensions are often reduced by changing attitudes to match actions. So cognitive dissonance can influence how people feel about themselves, how they view themselves, leading to negative feelings of self-esteem and self-worth, because people want to avoid this discomfort. Cognitive dissonance can have a wide range of effects. Dissonance can play a role in how people act, think, and make decisions. So we act to reduce the discomfort we feel when two of our thoughts clash. Our brain regions become active when people experience cognitive dissonance. And through cognitive dissonance, we often bring attitudes in line with our actions. So changing our behavior can change how we think about others and how we feel about ourselves. Social contagion, or behavioral contagion, some people will call it, is a type of social influence. It refers to propensity for a person to copy a certain behavior of others who are either in the vicinity or whom they have been exposed to. So an example of that is when you're in a large group and you're mimicking those around you. You may even see this as like sporting events, people in the crowd. would be pretty much an example of how, you're like, okay, they're doing this, so let me do it too. You might even, I don't know if you've ever heard of a chameleon, right? But a chameleon is able to adapt. So the chameleon effect refers to the tendency to adopt the postures, gestures, and mannerisms of interaction partners. This type of mimicking or mimicry occurs outside of conscious awareness and without any intent to mimic or imitate. So Solomon Asch and a few other researchers have found that people are most likely to adjust their behavior or thinking to coincide with the group standard, typically feel incompetent or insecure. Their group may have at least 3 people or so. Everyone else agrees. They admire the group status and attractiveness. They have not already committed to another response. They know that they're being watched or observed, right? Or their culture encourages respect for social standards. So those are some of the things that Solomon found as far as reasons why people will adjust their behavior based on a group. So which of the 3 comparison lines is equal to the standard line? So the photo on the right was taken after 5 people. Was taken after 5 people who were actually working for Asch had answered line 3. The student in the center shows the severe discomfort that comes from disagreeing with the response of other group members. And Solomon Asch's experiments actually revealed the degree to which a person's own opinions are influenced by those of groups. Asch found that people were willing to ignore reality and give a incorrect answer in order to conform to the rest of the group. So there are many reasons why people may conform. We have normative, social influence, and informational social influence. And normative is basically the type of social influence that leads to conformity, right? So an example is peer pressure or the desire to be liked, to belong to a group. In short, you adhere to the norms of a group, so you are accepted and are not really subject to social ridicule for being an outsider, avoiding that disapproval, right? The informational social influence is the influence resulting from one's willingness to accept others' opinions about reality. And a lot of times that can come from like scientists, lawyers, reporters and things like that. And it's, like lawyers and because they believe they may be experts in the field, so they just accept other people's opinions. Stanley Milgram did some experiments on obedience. Actually, included a link so that way that you can watch it. I don't know if you can actually click it from here, but I'll copy it on the homepage so that way you can watch it. But basically, he found out that people obeyed orders even when they thought they were harming other people. Strong social influence can make ordinary people conform to falsehoods or exhibit cruel behavior. In any society, great evil acts often grow out of people's compliance with lesser evil. Things have happened in the military very similar to this, and some like very terrible historical, instances have happened because they were, just regular normal people were obeying orders. Some more findings is that obedience was higher when the person giving orders was very close in proximity. The researcher was supported by a prestigious institution, or so they thought, and then the victim was depersonalized or at a distance, and there were no role models for defiance. They did a follow-up obedience experiment, and in a repeat of the earlier experiment, 65% of the adult male teachers fully obeyed the experimenter's command to continue. They did so despite the learner's earlier mention of a heart condition and despite hearing cries of protest after they administered what they thought were 150 volts and after hearing the agonized protest after they supposedly administered a shock of 330 volts. So when you're thinking about group behavior, social facilitation is actually something that comes up a lot. Now, social facilitation is basically the presence of others arouses people, improving performance. So you may see this from a musician, an actor, a performer who become energized by having an audience and does a better performance. Or some people will think performance can also be hindered because of the most likely, but not necessarily the correct response occurs. So hometown advantage, I'm sure you probably heard of that, but that's the tendency for the hometown to win more often than it loses. But the crowding effect is basically when there's a lot of people, and then there's intensified emotions regarding the experience. So it can be positive, or it may not be that great. The performances can be hindered. Even people who really aren't the best at shooting, they become better shooters when they're playing basketball, of course, when they're in their hometown. So it's very interesting, you know, how the presence of others, how the power of that can change a situation. I know oftentimes I mention CrossFit. I go to Gold City, and it's interesting. The trainer, she sits, or the other trainer, he'll sit and he'll watch us, and they'll motivate us the entire time we're working out. So it's like you kind of have to go hard because they're watching you, right? So they're observing you. And we tend to perform tasks more accurately, more quickly. Sometimes when people aren't watching, you might kind of be a little sketchy with your form and things like that. But the hometown advantage basically, helps to make sure that, well, it doesn't help to, but it just, when others are observing us, we tend to do task a little bit better. When you do well, you are likely to do even better in front of an audience, especially a friendly audience. What you normally find difficult may seem all but impossible, when you're being watched. And this is just showing you stats for those hometown advantage in team sports for for National Hockey League, for the NBA, for major soccer, Major League Soccer, things like that. So it is real. It is real. So if you've ever worked in a group, you've probably experienced this, but maybe you didn't know the term for it. But social loafing is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pooling their efforts toward attaining a common goal than when individually accountable. So in social psychology, social loafing is the phenomenon of a person basically just not doing as much work as everyone else around them are. You think about, like, you're playing tug of war, right? And you see everyone else pulling, so of course you're not going to pull as hard as the other people around you. So it's just basically causes of it is acting as a part of the group and feeling less accountable because it's not all on you. Feeling individual contribution may not matter, and also taking advantage. Some people take advantage of the situation. De-individuation is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint that occurs in group situations that foster arousal and anonymity, thrives in many different settings. So basically, it's generally thought of as a way of individuals losing who they are in groups. Some people mention like the KKK, or especially like during some of the protests when people were wearing masks. Um, but basically, some other examples of the individuation also occurs when people are wrapped up in a hobby or activity. For example, when people are in a mosh pit at a concert, they're punching the air and shaking their heads frantically. They wouldn't probably engage if they weren't a part of the crowd. And one of the reasons why de-individuation can be important, because it occurs when a person's identity with the group overrides their own identity and self-awareness. It could lead to mob mentality, and just sometimes it can just go bad. And this is just talking about, there were riots in 2011 in England, and most of the individuals were hoods and masks. Because of the anonymity, it just caused them to, like, do more harmful things. Um, it was just like they did things outside of their own identity and self-awareness, because at that particular point they were going with the group. Group polarization and group think. Group polarization is an example of an important phenomenon in social psych, and is observable by many different contexts. So, for example, a group of women who hold moderately feminist views tend to demonstrate heightened pro-feminist beliefs following group discussion. Like, internet communication magnifies this effect for better or for worse. You'll see a lot of this when people kind of get a little comfortable, or they are more, they have strengthened beliefs, even though maybe they would have just kind of been fell in the moderate area. But groupthink is, well, there's two well-known examples of groupthink. Actually, I'll talk about one, but engineers of the space shuttle for the Challenger knew about some faulty parts months before takeoff, but they didn't want negative press, so they pushed ahead with the launch anyways. But groupthink can sometimes lead to bad decisions because it encourages members of the group to ignore possible problems with the group's decisions and discount the opinions of outsiders. Um, so it influences decisions most when there are no clear rules for the decision making, which leads me to individual power, which or some people call personal power. It's just basically having strength, confidence, and competence. Um, it's an attitude based on your vision, your personal qualities, and you, because of that, you won't allow the minority or the majority to sway how you feel. Let's get into antisocial relations, and just kind of, I want you guys to know the difference between prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination. Oftentimes they are used interchangeably, but that isn't exactly correct. But prejudice is an unjustifiable attitude toward a group, members of a group. Prejudice generally involves stereotype beliefs. Um, it's usually incorrect attitude, generally negative attitude, based on that individual being a part of a social group. For example, a person may hold prejudiced views toward a certain race or certain gender. Um, and some examples or what sometimes causes, not examples, what causes an individual to be prejudiced could be their upbringing. If parents have prejudices of their own, there's a chance that these opinions will be passed to the next generation. And then often one bad experience with a person from a particular group can cause a person to think of all people from that group the same way. And I was actually in a group of colleagues, and they were speaking of some maybe I'm thinking they're Vietnamese individuals that that worked at or owned the nail salon, and they basically took their experiences from the nail salon to generalize towards all individuals who are Vietnamese. And I said, no, everybody, that's not how everyone acts. And you cannot generalize based on your experience with that individual. Even if you had 5 experiences with that individuals, there's millions of individuals that are Vietnamese. And there's no way that you can take that and come up with and have a belief of how everyone is. Stereotype is a generalized, sometimes accurate, but often overgeneralized belief about a group of people, like black men are better at basketball, or maybe let's see, Hell's Angels bikers dress in leather, right? Those are, I know that's, but it is a fixed overgeneralized belief about a particular a group of individuals. There are more black men in the NFL, and there probably are a lot of Hell's Angels bikers who wear leather. However, we can't generalize um, to that particular group because we don't know everybody, right? Um, Discrimination is an unjustifiable negative behavior. It's actually putting these things into action, right? These are a prejudice or stereotype is how you feel or what you believe, but discrimination is an actual action towards a group of people and its members. Job refusal, being dismissed, or having your shifts like cut down if you are working, if you're working at a certain job. Age discrimination, national sexual harassment, those are types of discrimination. Prejudice also, if you look at it, it's basically prejudgment, an unjustified negative attitude towards some group and its members, often targets a different cultural, ethnic, or general group. This is a picture of Trayvon Martin. I'm sure you've all heard this story. He went to the store. He was walking in his own neighborhood with juice and candy and was killed by an officer because he looked suspicious because he was wearing a hoodie. Anyone that's being walked, if somebody's walking behind me, whether and they're not like identifying themselves as a police officer, I'm gonna fight back too. But no, at any point did he deserve to be shot, and him to take his shooter to take matters in his own hands. Definitely is very, very sad. Very, very sad for Trayvon's family, and the fact that he isn't here anymore. But some components of it is beliefs, emotions, predispositions to action. So to actually discriminate against that individual, and discrimination is just a negative behavior. Period. So implicit prejudice is or so we're going to talk about a couple of terms related to implicit prejudice. One being implicit racial associations, and basically is there's an implicit associations test, but in the test it shows even people who deny racial prejudice may carry negative associations. We harbor in our subconscious. And it causes us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on their race, based on their ethnicity, their age, their appearance. Unconscious patronization is basic. An example would be and so it's lower expectations, right? Inflated praise and insufficient criticism for minority students. An example would be an example of this was when a white university student was given a test to grade by a black student, and the white person gave markedly high ratings and never expressed harsh criticisms of a black student's writing, even if it was actually there. It's because at that point they had lower expectations anyways, so that they didn't highlight the issues, which could have probably been easily corrected. But because if the student didn't see that they had these issues, now they go and turn in their test to the actual professor and they don't do as well, because at some point, and this could have been teachers, this could have been child care providers who didn't give they didn't provide sufficient criticism so that student can achieve on the same standards as any other student that may not be of the same race. So it's funny, prejudice is more often implicit. So it's that knee-jerking response that below the radar, it leaving us unaware of how our attitudes are influencing our behavior. And it's a lot of people probably struggle with that. I mean, um, even myself, like there may be things that I've learned and that are definitely in my subconscious or unconscious uh, that I've never really sat to think about. But actually, that's not true. Now that I understand explicit and implicit prejudice and biases and things like that. I do think about it, and I'm like, why did you do that? Why did you make that decision? So I can check myself. By educating yourself, you can check yourself. It's you can stay in a state of ignorance, right? It's a choice, right? Everybody can be ignorant, but there's no real reason for anyone to be ignorant when there's so much information around you. So sometimes when we have these knee-jerk responses, then sometimes we come back and think about things, and maybe the next time that you're in a situation, maybe you won't respond that same way because you know better, right? This is just showing prejudice over time for the support of like interracial dating, and how if you're born 1981 plus, that you really don't care. But anybody before that may have had an issue with it. You can see the percentages for support actually go down the older the person is. So yeah. So this is just, this was basically a experiment done by Keith Payne in 2006. People viewed a white or black face immediately by a flash gun or a hand tool, which was then followed by a masking screen. The participants were actually more likely to misperceive a tool as a gun when it was preceded by a black rather than a white face. Wonder why. So, gender prejudice is overt gender prejudice. Excuse me. I'm reading this incorrectly. Overt gender prejudice has declined sharply, but both implicit and explicit gender prejudice and discrimination persist. Despite equality between the sexes in intelligence scores, people have tended to perceive their fathers as more intelligent than mothers. And this just even goes on with like women making less money to the dollar, than men do. There's a quote actually in the book. It's on page 500. And it was by Thomas Page after transitioning from female to male. And he said, "Until I was a man, I had no idea how good men had it at work. The first time I spoke up in a meeting in my newly low, quiet voice and noticed that sudden focused attention, I was so uncomfortable that I found myself unable to finish the sentence." And basically what he's saying is like, at that particular point, people were actually paying attention to what he had to say, even though as a woman the intelligence was the same, right? Because all you're doing is transitioning from female to male, so the intelligence is the same. The brain didn't change, but the attention changed and the respect changed, according to Thomas Page McBee. And my cousin, she's an engineer, and she talks about this all the time. And she says how oftentimes she has to prove herself or go 150% above those around her, simply because a lot of times the men won't even listen to the women in her department. So she's had to do a lot to show them that she is capable of being a leader, because initially they weren't respecting her, and they weren't considering her as intelligent as the man across the room, which she probably was just as, or even more, And here are some stats on LGBT prejudice, and I won't read them all. 58% reported being subject to slurs or jokes. Gays and lesbians are America's most at-risk group for hate crimes, actually. So, social roots of prejudice, social inequalities often lead to the development of attitudes that justify the status quo, the state of things, the way things are, as opposed to the way things could be, the existing state of affairs, right? Um, the just world phenomenon is good is rewarded, and evil is punished, right? So what does that actually mean? I think it's because people want to believe that the world is fair. They will look for ways to explain or rationalize away injustice, often blaming the person in a situation who is actually the victim. And that reminds me of Ahmaud Arbery. Um, and what made me think of that is me and my husband, we are looking to buy a new home, and we were in a neighborhood where there was new construction. So I was like, I looked into a house. I was like, oh man, I want to get out and go look and see what was in there. And right there, I thought about Ahmaud Arbery. And I was like, this dude was running and looking in houses, houses in new construction, and just inquisitive about it, just looking around. And from that particular point, because they thought someone had been in there that looked a little shady, that it was this guy, right? He's running and looking in houses, and whether he was running or just looking in newly constructed houses, that's not against the law. And this man was killed by people who lived in the neighborhood. And people I read on social media were, well, he shouldn't have been looking in a house that doesn't belong. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's just a building, and it's just bones, and people like to look in bones, and just that as I thought back on that, and we were looking at homes, I'm like, dang, that could have been my husband, that could have been my son, that was literally just looking in a home that wasn't completed yet. He got killed for that. So, but there are people who have that attitude, that to rationalize and blame him for being killed, right? That's crazy. The uh, the stereotypes is just, it rationalizes inequalities. So, are you in group, out group? Where are you, right? Groups, the social identities people associate themselves with. In group would be us, right? People with whom we share common identity. Anybody that we don't share a common identity with would be considered them, right? They're perceived as different, apart from our in group. And then in group bias would be the tendency to then favor your own group. So then, what is a scapegoat theory? We've heard, oh, they're the scapegoat, right? But a scapegoat theory refers to the tendency to blame someone else for one's own problems, a process that often results in feelings of prejudice toward the person or group that the one is blaming, right? An example of scapegoating would be a person who blames his or her partner for a burglary because he or she left the door unlocked or left valuable possessions visible, is scapegoating. The purpose of scapegoating is basically just to take it. You want to let someone else bear the blame. You don't want to take responsibility for the blame. I believe there is. Let me see. So sometimes race conscious affirmative action can be taken. Some people will use the scapegoat theory for that. Well, I didn't get into UGA because of affirmative action, which being a person of color only gives you a certain amount of points. However, if your parent has attended the university, or there's other like check boxes, but it wouldn't, that person of color wouldn't surpass you just based on that alone. Their scores will basically take them over the top. If your parents went to a university, you would have a better chance of getting in than someone of color, even if your scores were less than theirs. Social characterization is the process by which people characterize themselves and others in differentiated groups. Um, Characterization simplifies perception and cognition related to the social world by detecting similarity relationships or by imposing structure on it, right? Um, Overestimation also occurs in the form of other race effects or bias. Um, Similarities are overestimated during characterization, which then actually create the us and them. For example, women, men, and the elderly and high school students will all constitute social categories. This was a study done with New Zealanders, and um, what happens is like sometimes, and this is coming straight from the book. Sometimes, however, people don't fit easily into our racial categories. For example, mixed race people are often assigned to their minority identity. Researchers believe this happens because after learning the features of a familiar racial group, the observer's selective attention is drawn to the distinctive features of the less familiar minority. So, um, because of that, they are typically considered. That's why most people I'll hear people who are mixed, maybe mixed with black and white, and they'll be considered black. They're just considered lighter skin, which they may have just 40% black and 60% white, right? But it's categorizing that person because their facial features are more similar to that of the minority group. So this is just showing how often stereotypes can feed into our ideas of what we think um, individuals are. So the Muslim terrorists who struck the United States on September 11th created in many minds an exaggerated stereotype of Muslims. I know plenty of Muslims, and I know that they're not going to go and do any sort of like dangerous or terroristic any terrorism in the community anywhere, honestly. The vast majority of Islamic people have no connection with and do not sympathize with terrorism. Now think back when were starting a relationship or friendship. What types of feelings did you feel? How did it stir? Like what were the effects? What was the first impression of that individual? So we're gonna talk about psychology of attraction, um, and how often we as social animals, as people who need people, we often will focus on like the bad side of of social relationships instead of the positives, right? So let's talk about the psychology of attraction, right? It provides proximity, right? Provides opportunity for aggression or friendship. In proximity, before friendships become close, they must first begin. Um, Proximity just means that you are close to that person, like you are able to see that person, repeated exposure to that individual. um, Physical attractiveness affects our first impression, predicts frequency of dating and popularity, and uh, because proximity gives us the contact, the beauty or the attractiveness will actually predict how often people date, how successful they will be. They tend to be more, um, they tend to be, let's see, more compassionate, healthier, um, or they're mostly perceived to be that way, right? Similarities of attitudes and interests, and you typically are attracted to people who are similar to you, right? We got the proximity; it brings us close. Then you might find, oh yeah, they're attractive. You got that, but you want to make sure that they are similar. Um, we like we like those individuals who like us. We like individuals who are similar to us, maybe, or will help us achieve our goals, um, and and like if I like soccer, they like soccer. I mean, it's those shared interests, beliefs, interests, age, religion, race, education, even smoking behavior, and economic status. So modern matchmaking, internet form relationships, and romantic relationships, or internet form friendships and romantic relationships are on average slightly more likely to last and be satisfying. Nearly one fourth of heterosexual couples and two-thirds of same-sex couples met online. Speed dating. People who fear rejection often elicit rejection. It's funny, right? You know, you're going to give it because you're like, oh, snap, I don't want it to happen to me. Given more options, people make superficial choices. Men wish for future contact with more of their speed dates. Women tend to actually be more choosy when it comes to speed dating. I've never done it. I mean, I'm married now, so I can't do it. My husband would beat me up. Not literally, because I can fight too. No. But no, I just always wanted to know what that would feel like, jumping from one person to the next. And is that even effective, or is it just really done for fun, you know? Physical attractiveness predicts how often people date. We talked about that earlier. People's attractiveness is unrelated to their self esteem and their happiness, which people think, like, they'll, especially now with Instagram, you're looking at these girls and these dudes and everyone else on social media, and they look great, and you think they're happy. Then you see they committed suicide, or they're just leading a very poor life. It does Just because someone is attractive does not mean that they have high self-esteem. Strikingly attractive people are sometimes suspicious that praise for their work may just be a reaction to their looks. Less attractive people are more likely to accept praise as sincere. For couples who were friends before lovers, who became romantically involved long after first meeting, looks actually matter less. Concepts of attractiveness just kind of depends on the culture. Um, Yet some adult features, such as healthy appearance and symmetrical face, seem to be attractive everywhere. Have you ever been in a relationship or started a relationship and you just couldn't get enough of that individual? Intensely desiring that partner, seeing them just stimulates blood flow. I've been there, not now, but um, and that's so great. Those relationships, they can last, but typically people will consider that lust. But in test of two-factor theory, college men have been aroused by fright, by running in place, by viewing erotic material, or by listening to humorous or repulsive monologues. They were then introduced to an attractive woman and asked to rate her. Unlike unaroused men, the stirred up men attributed some of their arousal to the women or girlfriend and felt more attracted to her. So, to be revved up and associate some of that arousal with a desirable person is to feel the pull of passion. Adrenaline makes the heart grow fonder. Sexual desire plus growing attachment equals passionate love. Arousal is definitely the key ingredient to romantic love. I mean, passionate love, excuse me. So, passionate love typically doesn't endure, right? But you can have deep, affectionate attachment um, for someone else, right? Passion fed hormones, which is testosterone, give way to oxytocin that support feelings of trust, calmness, and um, bonding. Sorry, attraction and sexual desire endure without the obsession of early stage marriage. Equity is important. Self disclosure deepens intimacy, and that happens especially. You'll find that the passionate love isn't. You're not going to find that as much as you grow a little bit older. Altruism is an unselfish concern for the welfare of others. People are most likely to help when they notice an incident, interpret it as an emergency, and assume responsibility for helping. Odds for being helped increase if the person appears to deserve help or is a woman, which yeah, I can say that is really true. Like I remember running out of gas. Stupid me. I was driving my husband's car. I didn't really know like I know how far I can let my car be on empty, but I didn't know his, so I'm just riding around and ran out of gas and quickly someone like pulled over to help me. I don't know if it was because I was a woman, but um, my odds seemed to be in my favor that day. Similarity to self, being unhurried or in a good mood. Feeling guilty and being focused on others and not preoccupied also raise the likelihood of someone helping you out as well. The tendency for any given bystander to be less likely to give aid if other bystanders are present. There was a situation very similar to this when I was in Atlanta. We were heading to go walking in Piedmont Park, and there was a gentleman. I don't know if he was homeless, but he definitely had the appearance of someone who may not have access to a shower and things like that. Um, but it was super hot that day. He was laying on the cement. Oh my God, it was so hot. And so I I saw people walking by, and even my friends were gonna walk by, but I couldn't let him stay there. And I called 911, and they came to help him, and he got up, and they were able to give him water and things like that. But typically, when there are a lot of people, I'm assuming if there are tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of people around, maybe I wouldn't have helped him. There were just a few people kind of walking by, but it wasn't like a lot of people on that road. So I wonder if it would have been different if I would have felt like, oh, you know what, somebody's gonna call, he'll be alright, you know. If I had, or they probably already called already, so he's probably good, you know. So it would have that feeling of responsibility would have been taken from me. So, norms for helping. Positive social norms encourage generosity and enable living. So, a socialization norm would be to acquaint individuals with the norms of a given social group or society. It prepares individuals to participate in a group by illustrating the expectations of a group. Socialization is very important for children who begin the process at home with family and continue that at school, right? The reciprocity norm is the norm that requires that we repay in kind what another has done for us. It can be understood as the expectation that people will respond favorably to each other by returning benefits for benefits and responding with either indifference or hostility to harms, right? Um, Social responsibility norm is a societal rule that tells people that they should help others when in need, even if doing so is costly. Um, Another norm that explains helping behavior is the going back to the reciprocity norm, which is the implicit societal rule that says people must help those who have helped them. So it kind of goes back and forth with that, right? You know that people are depending on you. However, when people are depending on you so much, you can't help yourself, you know, so you got to be careful of that as well. Conflict is the perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, and ideas. Conflict isn't always um, negative, it can be seen as positive. Um, and well, in situations of like partner sparring, political group feuding, nations at war, sometimes um, in in those situations, conflict may seed positive change or be a destructive process that can produce unwanted results. A social trap is a little bit different from that. It is a situation in which conflicting partners, by each pursuing their self interest rather than the good of the group, become caught in mutually destructive behavior. Um, I have an example here. Individual fish trawlers reasoned that the fish they took would not threaten the species, and that if they didn't take them, others would anyway. The result, some fish stocks have been depleted. Ditto for the buffalo hunters and the elephant tusk poachers of today. So it's just one of those things where, yeah, well, okay, I'm just going to make sure it benefits myself. Everybody's benefiting themselves, which makes it really bad for the group. So mirror image perception is basically when we see someone as something and they feel the same exact way about us. It's the human tendency to see oneself, especially while in conflict, as the opposite of the person with whom they are having the conflict with. Um, so both of you guys are seeing each other the same way. So when one person or party sees the person or the party they oppose as evil and wrong, the party sees them the same exact way. Enemy perceptions describe the outgroup bias in which we perceive those who are against us. It commonly occurs in wars and hostile social disagreements. People view the opposing side as being different, hostile, and generally bad. And perceptions can be self-fulfilling prophecies, right? And everybody you probably heard this term before, but it's a sociological term used to describe a prediction that causes itself to become true. Therefore, the process by which a person's expectations about someone can lead to that someone behaving in a way which confirm the expectations. Prophecy, right? Okay.